Hello everybody, today we'll be discussing a new aspect to our study of the Indian diaspora, in which we'll be talking about the changing relationship between the Indian diaspora, development and the Indian state, with a special focus on the role that is played by the Indian diaspora. Now, the Indian diaspora is more than 32 million strong, and it is generally consisted of individuals who occupy extremely affluent and powerful and influential positions in the host countries, or definitely form a migrant labor majority percentage in other host countries. So in the first instance, we are talking about countries like the UK or the USA, while in the second instance, we are talking about countries like the UAE. But all in all, regardless of how heterogeneous their composition is, it is undeniable that the Indian diaspora, due to their numerical strength, their affluence and their influence, form a very important deciding factor in India's diplomacy and in India's foreign relations. And in fact, because they were extremely instrumental in rescuing India out of its balance of payments crisis repetitively throughout the years, but most recently in 2017 and 18, it does explain why the current Modi government has used so much of its resources on focusing on and on bettering a better engagement with the diaspora, or on essentially strengthening their diasporic policy. And there have been many initiatives that have been taken by the government for this to happen, which we will discuss in a while. But essentially, the argument that I'm making is that it does make sense why there is so much heightened focus on diasporic engagement, because there, if nothing else, the cultural and the economic value that comes with this diaspora homeland relationship, that must be definitely focused on, and the government has realized the economic benefits that come from that. Now, when we talk about the relationship between the diaspora and development and the Indian state, it's important to understand, as we had discussed in the last talk, that it is a consistently evolving relationship. Just after independence, newly decolonized countries like India or like Taiwan were focusing on a closed, inward-looking model of development and economic growth. And essentially, this was based on a kind of internal consolidation and pursuance of self-reliance in various sectors of the economy. And the effort was to prevent an overexposure to the external economies or to the international community, as well as an over-dependence on imports. So in this case, essentially, obviously, this was accompanied by a territorially defined notion of nationhood as well as citizenship. And this is unsurprising, because for all of these countries, the idea of a nation was completely new. It was something that was completely made, that they had won and achieved after a hard-won independence. So obviously, the effort was to strengthen this nation, to grow it from within. So in this case, where there is a territorially defined notion of nationhood, a territorially defined notion of citizenship, as well as an inward-looking, a closed economy, obviously, individuals who were diaspora, who were situated outside the home country, were treated with some kind of suspicion and caution. Now, all of this changed with the successive waves of globalization that overtook the world, and that essentially led to the free movement of goods and capital and ideas and technology and communications and all of these. And essentially, this led to the development of a symbiotic relationship between the movement of goods and capital and the movement of people. And this led to the development of a diaspora, which has multiple affinities and multiple loyalties in variously different social and economic nations and structures. And these diaspora were essentially, negotiating this relationship in the best way they knew how, and thereby forming symbiotic economic relationships in that process, essentially. And it is this diaspora that became the sort of ambassadors of this new post-national concept of citizenship and post-national concept of nationhood. So the main driving factor why this diaspora and the diaspora started to become appreciated, and there were efforts to engage with the diaspora more by the Indian state, though the first massive amount of efforts was done by the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government and now by the Modi government. In fact, no other prime minister has engaged with the diaspora as much as Modi has, and it is very true that in recent years, the Indian diaspora are generally huge supporters of Modi as well, because they do see him as a national leader, whereas Modi does see them as incredible sources of not only India's cultural reaffirmation, but as well as an incredible source of remittances as well. So essentially, why is the diaspora important? So there are various reasons, but in essence, the first most important argument for looking at the diaspora as important figures in and essentially making them the focus of diasporic engagement policies is that they send a lot of remittance home. And especially for families in rural areas whose children or whose family members are working abroad who are sending these remittances home, reports by the National Sample Survey Organization have definitely found that remittance receiving households are financially and economically much better off than those that do not receive remittance, and a massive amount of the remittance is essentially spent on subsistence and food and healthcare, and not a lot on education, which is also quite telling on in other factors as well. But the essence here is that because this much money is spent on remittance, is spent from remittances that have come to rural households, it is obvious that remittances do play a lot of role in raising the standard of life for the rural poor in India. So they do definitely help in a huge degree of poverty alleviation. That is number one. The second offshoot of the development of MNCs and development of high-tech companies in hubs like Bangalore or Hyderabad is that it has created a culture of entrepreneurship and an environment of entrepreneurship where Indian startups and Indian entrepreneurship can flourish. So where these hubs have been created by companies, MNCs, international companies like Google or Facebook, there have also followed Indian startups like Swiggy or Ola or Zomato, for example. So this entire culture of entrepreneurship is essentially boosted by not only the presence of international companies that are essentially run by the Indian diaspora or where Indian diaspora are important, but also because of the fact that they also engage in a huge amount of investment. Whether it be angel investing or later stages of the business, they invest into Indian startups, into Indian entrepreneurship, which then leads to an overall growth of the economy as well. Now, a less tangible aspect of an advantage that the diaspora offers is also that there is a chance of diasporic diplomacy. Now, because the diaspora do occupy important positions in the politics, in the societies, in various media houses, in international countries, they also therefore hold a lot of power and influence to essentially lobby and advocate for their home country. So there is always a focus here to deepen a home country and diaspora relationship, because when a diasporic organization or an individual invests in the country or advocates for the home country, they are not doing it for the same reasons that any other foreign body is doing it. Of course, there is a profit initiative or a profit motive here, but scholars essentially note that more than that, there is also a sense of emotional and cultural tie with the homeland. In fact, this is the major reason why diasporic organizations were so successful in raising funds and vaccines and oxygen beds and oxygen cylinders and hospital beds and life-saving medicines during especially the second wave of the COVID pandemic. So there is a difference between diasporic engagement and the engagement of any other foreign party, and this is where the Indian government has sought to essentially hedge their bets upon. So diasporic diplomacy would therefore mean utilizing or employing these diaspora as unofficial ambassadors for the Indian state to essentially argue for or to essentially advocate for the Indian state's interests in various international fora. So, for example, in the United Nations Security Council, India has been wanting and campaigning for permanent membership for many years, because it would allow them veto power, which would of course allow them to reach closer to the status of a regional power and definitely combat China, which already has a veto power. So there is an effort at this point to essentially employ the Indian diaspora's considerable strength to ensure and to convince countries like Canada or to convince countries like the East Asian countries which have a strong Indian diaspora population, or even countries like the UK, to essentially lobby internally for India's permanency in the Security Council. This is the same for India's participation in regional bodies as well, because India does have a strong diasporic population in Malaysia, Thailand and Singapore. So the effort here is also to essentially utilize this diaspora to ensure that India's role in the international community can be essentially enhanced. Now, of course, there are challenges that accompany an enhanced focus on a diaspora policy. The first thing is that when remittances come in, it is happening legally, then of course it is beneficial for the economy. But there are illegal organizations within this country, whether they be insurgent groups or extremist or terrorist groups, that receive money from illegal hawala channels from diaspora that are located outside the country. Then the kind of propaganda that accompanies the diasporic engagement may also be problematic, because, for example, when after Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's visit to India, there was also an increased demand for the separatist Khalistan movement by the Sikh diaspora that is located in Canada and elsewhere. So there are issues essentially that are related to enhanced engagement with the diaspora. Perhaps the largest issue, of course, is that the diaspora may have the vulnerability of becoming over-dependent on the Indian state, which would be extremely expensive for the Indian government. So the Indian government is looking to essentially balance these two contradictory but equally beneficial frameworks essentially. Now, what has the Modi government done and how has it essentially enhanced its engagement with the diaspora? Now, it can be said that there is a policy continuum that is found between the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government and the Modi government with relation to their engagement with the diaspora. So the first, of course, is that the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government launched the Know India program that is essentially aimed mostly towards Girmitya youth. Now, Girmitya essentially are the descendants of the individuals who had been sent to places like the Caribbean or Fiji or Mauritius or the Trinidad or Tobago during the Indian indentured system as indentured laborers to work in the plantations as a replacement for the slaves, or after slavery had been discontinued or abolished. So the purpose of the Know India program essentially is to strengthen India and diaspora relationships, to allow them to essentially know their country, to feel at one with India's culture and heritage. There have also been efforts by the UGC or the University Grants Commission to offer scholarships to diaspora to study in UGC approved colleges in India. There have been Bharat Ko Jano quizzes that have been launched online on various Pravasi Bharati Divas to essentially ensure or to inform the diaspora about various interesting facts about the country. Now, economically speaking, the government has essentially launched the e-migrate system, which essentially ensures or requires any employers, any foreign employers, to register on the government database to ensure that no kind of exploitation happens or no kind of forced labor or any kind of situation which would put a diaspora that is going essentially from here to countries like the UAE, to Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, to essentially where they would be exploited. So, of course, these countries have condemned the migrant system as a sort of harassment of their sovereignty. But of course, most researchers or most scholars also believe that this is obviously a good step towards securing the interests of the diaspora, who are not affluent and who are but much more populous in number. There is also there are post offices that have been, head post offices have been allowed to function as passport issuing centers to allow larger sections of the population access to passports. Nurses can only be hired from one of several state recognized institutions to ensure that there is no exploitation or sex trafficking that is happening. There's also the minimum wages referral system that has essentially been launched, which essentially ensures that diaspora working as industrial laborers or cleaners or domestic servants in ECR or immigration clearance required countries have a minimum fixed wage. Of course, there are negative consequences of this particular as well, because essentially what this has done is it has raised the price, or it has raised the salaries of Indian diaspora, the requisite salaries of the Indian diaspora. So often what this has led to is that these countries have found cheaper labor from Pakistan or Bangladesh. Now, all in all, the Indian diaspora is an absolute powerhouse of whether it be economic or cultural, societal or political benefits to the country. And yes, there are challenges to essentially enhancing or their engagement, the Indian government's engagement with the diaspora. However, if there is a way to essentially capitalize on the diaspora-homeland relationship, to capitalize on the emotional ties that the diaspora has with the homeland and that the homeland has with the diasporas, there are only positive repercussions that India will see in the years to come.